What Donald Trump is doing is shooting the U.S. in the foot. He's doing more than anybody has ever done to actually harm American exports. This is vintage chaos. The most damaging thing for the United States is not the trade war. It's the attack on our science, an attack on our universities, attack on the institutions that gave us really the comparative advantage in technology. It's where we are.
Welcome to another special edition of the forecast from Washington, D.C. A rather stormy Washington, D.C., as you can tell, and the storm kind of reflects the political and economic mood at the moment. Here to unpeel the onion of this extraordinary week of events on the markets and in the White House behind me, I'm very happy to say I'm joined by Professor Joseph Stiglitz, one of the most eminent economists in this country. Amongst other things, he was economics professor at Columbia University, chief economist at the World Bank, and of course, a Nobel laureate. Welcome, Professor Stiglitz.
Nice to be here.
So I want to start off with a quote that caught my eye this morning from Bill Ackman, one of the billionaire hedge fund buddies of President Trump, who was panicking about 7 days ago about the markets going down too quickly for his liking. And then when there was a reprieve to most of the tariffs of 90 days announced by the White House and the markets shot up, this guy, Mr. Ackman, said, vintage out of the deal. This is a brilliant president. Do you agree with him?
No. And you have to remember that market then went down again. This is vintage chaos that we've seen a really trademark of Donald Trump.
And how dangerous is this chaos, which seems to be soldiering on, not just for the US economy, but the world economy?
Very dangerous. You know, we've had 80 years of trying to create a rule of law, a world in which borders didn't matter very much, where we created complex and long supply chains. And all that is being thrown in the dustbin. It means that countries can't take advantage of comparative advantage as they did before. They can't rely on the rule of law as they did before. Business really doesn't like the kind of uncertainty, chaos, and the absence of a rule of law.
Of course, Trump and his friends in the White House would say this is about redressing the unfairness against America on trade. This is about making sure that China eventually, after this trade war finishes, behaves correctly in terms of its trade practices. Do they have a point?
A very small point. Let me make it clear. The United States and to some extent Western Europe wrote the rules of the game. And so it's ironic that we are now complaining that the rules of the game that we wrote are working, and we wrote them, let me make it clear, for the interest of American corporations and other Western corporations, American financial institutions. We wrote them for our advantage. And now we're complaining the system is unfair. You know, what I hear is, yes, there may be some unfairness, but it's tilted towards the United States, not away from the United States. The problem here is that he is interpreting trade deficits, and particularly deficits in goods, as a symptom of unfair trade. I mean, and the logic is a very simplistic logic that we're better than any other country, therefore we ought to be exporting more than we're importing. And therefore, if we're importing more, it must mean that somebody's doing something naughty. The fact of the matter is, when you have a trade deficit at a multilateral level, it's a symptom of a macroeconomic problem. In particular, it's a symptom that the country's aggregate domestic savings is less than its domestic aggregate investment, and there's going to be a capital inflow to make up for that difference, and corresponding to that capital inflow is a trade deficit. It's that simple.
Yeah. So basically, what Donald Trump was trying to do was punish foreign countries for not buying American goods. So this isn't just about tariffs. This is about the inability or the unwillingness or the unaffordability of places like Cambodia or Laos or Vietnam to buy expensive American stuff that they may not want.
Exactly. And there's even a deeper flaw that in a modern world, we've moved from just trade in goods to trade in goods and services. You know, manufacturing is only less than 10% of the US economy in GDP and employment. Services are multiple of goods. And the United States is a major exporter of services, health services, financial services, tourism. And what Donald Trump is doing is shooting the U.S. in the foot. If you look at what he's done in terms of the attack on our universities, one of our most important institutions, it makes it more difficult for us to export our educational services. If you look at what he's doing to tourists, including from the UK and from other countries wanting to come to the United States, there's the threat that they will be put in detention, shipped off to some place, and without the kinds of normal safeguards that you expect in a democratic country. So that's discouraging tourism. So he's doing more than anybody has ever done to actually harm American exports.
So the tariffs that he's imposed, I mean, the ones against China seem to be going up every day. I think the last time I looked, there was 140% American tariffs versus 125 from China. Then, of course, all the other tariffs that may or may not come back in 90 days' time. I mean, the last time we had tariffs like that was in 1903, more than a century ago. Is that the mindset of Donald Trump, do you think? That, early 20th century, is that where he's gone back to?
Very much so. When the U.S. was a dominant power, this "Make America Great Again" is a going back to a world that no longer exists, a world where manufacturing dominated, where the U.S. dominated, and we could basically get away with anything. The United States now is less than 20% of global GDP. And China, in terms of purchasing power parity, is a larger economy than the United States. And there's another asymmetry that Donald Trump hasn't fully grasped, that when we're imposing these high tariffs on China, it creates an aggregate demand problem for China. And they've been worried about that, and they anticipated that. And correcting an aggregate demand problem is not as difficult as correcting an aggregate supply problem. And what the tariffs against China are doing is creating an aggregate supply problem, because our supply is so dependent on complex supply chains in which China plays a central role. We saw that after the pandemic and when Russia invaded Ukraine. Remember, in those days, there were these interruptions to supply, and we had enormous inflation. We couldn't get some critical goods. That's what Donald Trump is doing. He's creating unnecessarily those supply side interruptions that we experienced just a few years ago.
The other thing, of course, he wants to do, two things really. He wants to increase the revenue, the amount of money the American government makes from these tariffs, and he wants to bring jobs back to the Rust Belt, to all those manufacturing towns that have been desolate for decades now. Are those not two contradictory things? Because, of course, the less people sell to America, the less revenue there'll be from tariffs. And, the jobs don't necessarily come back if no one's going to buy the stuff that they produce.
It's actually worse than you just described, because first, if we get manufacturing back, it's going to be modern manufacturing. I just saw a factory in China where they're producing 1,000 cars a day with 2,000 workers. most of the production was done by robots. Modern manufacturing
Mm.
is very advanced, and China now has a comparative advantage in engineering, which is at the
Mm.
core of modern manufacturing. So, because we have not invested in railroads, we've not invested in logistics, we have a comparative disadvantage in some of the
Mm.
core ingredients
Mm.
for manufacturing. Secondly, it takes a long time to produce many of the to create the factories. And given the chaos that he's created, firms are going to be
Mm.
worried about moving into the United States. Thirdly, and most importantly, he's raised tariffs on steel and aluminum, uh, key ingredients into the production of other goods. And by increasing the cost of production, he makes American exports less competitive. So, in fact,
Mm.
while he may create a few jobs in, say, steel or aluminum, he destroys many more jobs in the sectors that in the areas where we use steel and aluminum. So he again is engaged in job destruction. So when economists look at the whole portfolio of what he has done, it's much more job destruction than job creation.
Mm. I wonder, because it makes so little economic sense, what he's been doing, whether this is just really political. And what it's really about is trying to limit the expansion of China, put China back in its box. Because as you've just said, you know, when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to innovation, when it comes to production, and maybe even, you know, services down the road, China, a nominally communist state, is beating America at the capitalist game.
That's right. You know, in some areas we do have enormous strengths, and one of our strengths was our universities, our research establishment. And he, in the last 3 months, has done more to damage that than any competition with China. So, over the short, medium, and long term, he's really undermining the strength, the key strength of the United States. It's like he's been attacking the United States far more than China has been doing any damage. Uh, there's another element that one can't underestimate, and that is the amateurness of his team. You know, I've talked to people who've been countries, you know, engaged in negotiations. It's not like the normal negotiation where one side comes in, both sides come in with a sound understanding of economics, a strong view of what they want, and you have experienced and well-informed negotiators. This is amateur hour. And so
Mm-hmm.
you have some people who may be bright, may have been really good on Wall Street, but that doesn't mean that they have any fundamental knowledge of the deep
Mm.
intricacies of economic policy. And
Yeah.
so you have people who've been working
I
on these
want,
issues for decades and trying to interact with somebody who's just begun to think about these issues. They find it frustrating.
but also I wonder if it's amateur hour because what's far more important for Donald Trump and the people around the cabinet table is loyalty to the boss than any kind of expertise, which might involve them contradicting him.
That's right. And there's an element of what is going on of a cultural revolution. You know, we've been talking about China, and China went through a devastating cultural revolution, and it was that experience that led to them to their reform and openness strategy, which over 45 years has led to the highest rates of growth and the largest numbers of people moved out of poverty in the history of mankind. Uh, we didn't learn the lessons of China's Cultural Revolution. And what I see going on right now on the attacks on the universities, the attacks on expertise, are have a kind of close relationship to what happened. It's sort of like the establishment failed me. That's what failed us. And these are the elites that look down on us, and it's not true. They were trying to create a better world for everybody, but there's that grievance, and they're going to shoot the country in the foot by destroying the expertise.
And in this trade war between China and the US, which seems to be getting worse every day, what are the consequences of that going to be for China, for US, and also for the world economy?
Well, as we said, for 45 years, we've tried to create this global economy based on complex supply chains, comparative advantage, and the standards of living on average around the world have increased, and numbers of people moved out of poverty are enormous. The closing of the gap between China and the United States, and the fact that China now, in terms of the standard way of measuring the purchasing power parity, China is now larger than the United States. It's still per capita income is much lower, but it has 4 or 5 times the number of people, so that it is a larger economy. The United States resents that. And Professor Graham Allison at Harvard has talked about this as the Thucydides trap, that the country that was number one doesn't like the number two country coming up and threatening their dominant position. Well, China has been thinking about this issue for a long time. After the first Trump administration, they began a process. Didn't go fast enough, didn't go far enough, but are now and have anticipated what the United States is doing. So they are relatively well prepared. You know, they've had some adverse event. Nobody could have anticipated COVID. They didn't manage COVID well. But where they are today, they are in a deeply optimistic position. DeepSeek, the advances in robotization, their integration into the global economy, give them a sense of confidence. So I think with difficulty, they're going to be able to manage through this. On the other hand, as I said before, Donald Trump has not fully anticipated the extent to which our supply chain is so dependent on China, and just breaking it dramatically like that.
Yeah.
I'm afraid we'll have some consequences for the United States, including inflation, and the Fed is going to respond to the inflation by raising interest rates. We're good chance of having the worst of all possible worlds, stagflation, which means that we will have a recession and inflation. The critical question, he wants the United States to be great again. Will he restore manufacturing to the United States? Will he restore America's dominance in this area? There will be some movement of some firms back to the United States. That will occur. But overall, because, as I say, we're a service sector, we're a knowledge-based economy, and I said that well before Donald Trump came on the scene, in the key areas that are important for a 21st century economy, we'll be worse off. And so I think that the adverse consequences of this chaos for the United States are going to be quite significant. Now, the really interesting question, I think, is Europe. Europe finds it difficult to work together. The attack by the U.S. against Europe has been uniting. A lot of discussion about the creation of a European defense force for a long time, and there seems to be a significant movement in that direction. If Europe gets united, responds strongly to the war in Ukraine, creates a European defense force, scraps some of the constraints that they've imposed on their fiscal policy, and reassesses its trade relationships with China and the rest of the world, I think Europe can navigate its way through this very difficult period and emerge actually stronger, rather than being a sort of a dependent on the United States. There will be a more united Europe as a very important, and I would say the critical country in the world, country or region, supporting democracy and human rights. So that's my hope. A lot rests on what Europe does.
Where does this leave Britain, the piggy caught in the middle, if you like, between the European Union and the United States, with which it hopes it still has some kind of special relationship?
I think it's important for the UK to cast its lot with human rights and democracy. And unfortunately, Trump is moving away from both of those. And so when I say UK has to cast its lot with human rights and democracy, that means it has to move back towards Europe. And that doesn't mean it has to rejoin the EU, but it does mean it has to coordinate and be an active part of the European Defense Force, cooperate with industrial policy, climate change, creating a kind of new multilateralism, which unfortunately, for a while, may not, the U.S. won't be at the center. The EU will be at the center. And the UK can be an important partner of the EU.
Just back to China briefly, what are the ways in which China, which is the second biggest holder of American debt, can retaliate against the United States in this trade war?
Well, I don't think it will actually do anything about, quote, dumping its U.S. Treasury bills. It would not be in its own interest to drive down the price of those Treasury bills. It could do that, but I don't think that will happen. China has many cards in its hands. It is the dominant player in a whole set of minerals and other natural resources. While we weren't paying attention, it developed this dominance in materials that are essential for your smartphone, for renewable energy. It's really quite remarkable that if you thought that there was a conflict of that kind, you would have begun to try to make sure you had the natural resources that would make you able to have what might be called national economic sovereignty. But the first Trump administration didn't pay any attention to that. It was more concerned with grievance and I would say another bad trade policy, but not with the extreme chaos that we have today. There's one other dimension, obviously, that it could undertake. It's no longer dependent in the way that it was 25 years ago on American investment. It has an enormous amount of savings. We don't have that kind of savings. It has far more engineers than we do, so it's in many areas equal to or surpassed American engineering. So its dependence on American firms has gone down. So take one example that might be very salient. Uh, in, in EV, electric vehicles, China's electric vehicles, BYD and a whole set of other companies, are now much better, much cheaper than Tesla.
Mm.
So
Mm.
it could tax the profits of Tesla, not worry that, well, Tesla might say, we're not going to invest anymore in China. They don't need Tesla's investment. Apple makes a
Mm.
significant fraction of its profits from China, and it could tax Apple more. So this is not what it wants to do. It wants to
Mm.
continue an arrangement of cooperation. Their leaders have made it very clear they want to cooperate,
Mm.
but they're not going to kowtow. They're not going to
Mm.
be subservient. And to put it in a broader historical context, which many Americans don't take into account, you remember in the middle of the 19th century, uh, there were trade wars.
Mm.
Those trade wars were actually with guns. Europe, with the support of the United States, invaded China and demanded that China open up its doors to opium, to the sale of opium. They
Mm.
were called the Opium Wars. And it was a disaster for China. But we insisted this was what fair trade, free trade was about. China had to open its doors to opium. It's ironic that now we're talking about fentanyl, but that history, which led to what are called the concessions in Shanghai and other cities in China, where they had to give up territory where European powers ruled effectively, that memory is still there. And so I do not see any way in which China is going to kowtow to the United States where Donald Trump demanding something of China is going to get the
Mm.
resolution. It has to be a dialogue based
Mm.
on equality. And one of the problems here is they're more informed and they've been
Mm.
better trained in the United States universities.
Mm.
Their experts
Mm.
actually know more about economics in many cases than the negotiators that we're sending from the United States.
So, briefly, would you say that what Donald Trump has done, what he's decided to do for political and perhaps economic reasons, has hastened the ascendancy of China and the decline of America?
Yes, that's true. I don't think the damage necessarily, in terms of this relative position, is permanent, um, but it's very, very deep. Uh, the most damaging thing for the United States is what is not the trade war. It's the attack on our
Mm.
science, an attack on our universities, attack on the institutions that gave us really the comparative advantage in technology. It's
Mm.
where we are today. So his attack on those fundamental institutions uh, probably is the most damaging thing. But
Mm.
equally damaging is the attack on the rule of law. The way in which he's trampled on the safeguards, the just ignoring the law,
Mm.
and the last Nobel Prize in economics was given for uh, studies that emphasize something that I and a lot of
Mm.
other people have talked about for a long time, what has given rise to the wealth of nations, to the success of countries like the UK, the United States, Western Europe, is the rule of law, the kind of certainty that
Mm.
that gives for investment. And he's destroyed that. So this sort
Of
of
course,
triple win of destroying,
Yeah.
attacking science and universities, attacking the rule of law, and then attacking the trade framework and the international rule of law, has really damaged the United States, I think, very seriously.
And of course, one of the things that's really suffered is trust in the United States. And trust in the United States is one of the things that has always upheld the dollar, the US dollar, as the currency of reserve. I mean, you've effectively had a golden credit card for decades. Is there a danger that that golden credit card will now be demoted to silver or, heaven forbid, even bronze?
You're absolutely right, and let me say emphasize something that many of us again have talked about for several decades: the importance of soft power. It was U.S. soft power that was really much more important than our hard power. People respected us because we were a caring country, a successful country. People looked at us and said, "We want to be like that." Now, when people look at the U.S., they say, "No, we don't want to be like that. Look what he's doing to the universities. Look what he's doing to the rule of law. Look at the inequality. Look at the oligarchy, the role of money, the corruption." So we are losing our soft power. Another example of the shooting ourselves in the foot, when he shut down USAID overnight, it resulted in thousands of children dying in Africa because they couldn't get the medicines. It again undermined respect for the United States. What kind of country could do that? It's an embarrassment. So he has destroyed our soft power. Now, to come to the more narrow question of the dollar as a reserve currency, China already anticipated this problem. It used to hold two trillion or more dollars in its reserves. The latest numbers that I've heard reported are it's down to 700 billion. It's diversified. Gold, euro, Japanese yen. So this march away from the dollar as a reserve currency is already way. Trump wants to have it both ways. It wants to have the dollar as a reserve currency, but also not have the one critical disadvantage of the reserve currency. And that advantage is that if you are a reserve currency, people will be accumulating dollars. If they're accumulating dollars, that is equivalent to a capital inflow, and a capital inflow is equivalent to a trade deficit. He doesn't like the trade deficit, but you cannot be a reserve currency without having a trade deficit. The trade deficit normally gives rise to deficiency of aggregate demand. That deficiency of aggregate demand requires fiscal stimulus. That fiscal stimulus means a fiscal deficit. And the hawks, the fiscal hawks, the Republican Party don't like that. The UK understood this under Keynes. And some people say it was Keynes' insight to say, let's not be a reserve currency. Let's get rid of this hot potato. And that had undermined the strength of the UK. Triffin talked about, a great professor in the last century, talked about what was called the Triffin paradox, that the reserve currency to maintain that reserve currency, you have to get more and more deficits accumulating over time. And that, of course, as that debt increases, the confidence in the reserve currency decreases. And so he said, there's a kind of tension here. Now, the way Trump wants to resolve this is to break the laws of arithmetic and just destroy economics. The particular proposal that he has has been, I don't know if you've heard about the Mar-a-Lago Accord, and one feature of that is that countries around the world would trade in their T-bills for century bonds which did not yield any interest. And officials in other governments that I talked about and say, well, what do you think about this? They say, well, that's equivalent to a default. And so what some people in the Trump administration are talking about is a default on the dollar. If that discussion continues, that, of course, will undermine the U.S. as a reserve currency.
Finally, Professor Stiglitz, I mean, Scott Bessent, the Treasury Secretary, said the other day, the next 4 years of this administration are going to be about Main Street and not about Wall Street. A kind of populist message from a rather unlikely man, to be honest. If what's happening at the moment means pain on Main Street, inflation, job losses, do you think that American society can sustain that, or will there be a mass kind of electoral rebellion against Donald Trump and his people?
I think there will be an electoral rebellion. What many Americans are now worried about is, will we have free elections in 2026?
You really think
Donald
that's
Trump,
a danger, that you won't have free elections?
Well, remember what happened in 2020. Donald Trump tried to overturn a free and fair election where Joe Biden won by 7 million votes. He tried to overturn that. Now, one can't help but ask the question, if you accumulate a lot of power, if you show that you're willing to trample the rule of law, is it not conceivable that you would use that power and your insensitivity to the rule of law to maintain your power? And it's not that difficult, because all you have to do is intervene in a limited number of elections, because we have red states, we have blue states, and then we have purple states. And so if you intervene in enough of the purple states, you can ensure that you maintain power. So because we are a divided country, it's not like he has to shut down the whole electoral process. All he has to do is intervene in a relatively few states, congressional districts, and we will not have free and fair elections. That is the worry.
Is America becoming the most powerful banana republic the world has ever seen?
I think that's the worry. And it's a banana republic in so many ways. When we talk about banana republics, we often talk about leaders who don't have expertise, who govern on whims, with authoritarian figures, who may have flawed views, grievances, and it's their whims and their misconceptions, obsessions, which dictate economic and other social policies. And we've never had a banana republic with so much military power. And that is what is so scary.
Professor Joseph Stiglitz, thank you very much indeed for joining us on this special edition of The Forecast from Washington, D.C.
It's been a pleasure.